Professor Tomohiko Taniguchi is a longtime columnist and observer of U.S.-Japan relations, as well as a former advisor to the late Shinzo Abe. Today, we will discuss the recent arc of U.S.-Japan-China relations, as well as what the current moment of tension between the U.S. and Japan means for the future of the relationship and the region at large. Co-hosting today is Charles Litchfield of the Atlantic Council, and thanks to the U.S.-Japan Foundation for sponsoring this episode. Tomohiko, welcome to ChinaTalk. So we are recording this on Tuesday, July 15th, a few days before an election in Japan, and in the midst of an increase in, I don't know, are we going to call this a trade war? But rising tariffs on the part of the U.S. Why don't you maybe start out by laying out the kind of state of play with respect to the U.S.-Japan relationship in the Trump 2.0?
There was a much worse moment than it is today. If you recall what the situation was like in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and up till the early 2000s, the trade frictions, usually dubbed, as you say, a war between the United States and Japan, were much more tense and fierce, and it was almost as if Japan was America's primary adversary. So compared to that, what's going on at the moment is manageable, and one should not forget a bigger picture. That is that without the United States and Japan closely working together, you couldn't possibly cope with this juggernaut in the making, which is in Japan's or for that matter, America's neighborhood.
All right. Well, since you brought us there, let's take it all the way back to the late 70s and 80s. You mentioned that it felt a lot more severe and dire at the time. How did that sort of manifest in domestic Japanese politics?
Right. It was in the Reagan era, but continued to become worse. The bottom was hit, I think, during the Clinton era, and Japan's terms of trade were severely negatively affected by the engineered appreciation of the Japanese currency from something like 240 versus $1 to even 79 versus $1. And that actually set in train Japan's massive investment into Southeast Asian nations. Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia took off in not a small part because of the massive inflow of Japanese capital. And the end result is that you now see a great supply chain that is covering those nations. So history is sometimes ironic. The attack, quote unquote, against Japan culminated in the boost for those Malaysia, Indonesia, Southeast Asian nations' economies. So that was then. Today, Japan, as many of your viewers and listeners do understand, is the biggest ever investor in the United States, having created a big number of jobs in, interestingly, battleground states such as Ohio, where Japanese auto manufacturer Honda has been in place operating for some time and having created many jobs. However, that rhetoric has not worked vis-a-vis Donald Trump. So I think President Trump wants to tell a lesson or two to the U.S.'s long-term allies, including Japan, that nothing is free and you must pay your own club fee if you wish to maintain the order maintained not by China but by the United States.
Do you think that President Trump has a particular fixation with Japan? In the period we were mentioning just a few seconds ago, in the 80s, he himself, as he became a popular figure on people's TV screens quite often, would mention how Japan and Japanese exports to the US were causing jobs to be lost in the US. So he certainly had a fixation then. But do you think that's rubbed off on his policies now, or Japan is just one of many that he's going after?
The late Prime Minister Abe, with whom I worked happily, may I say, for almost 80 years, played golf together with DJT a number of times, not because both of these men were avid golf fans, but because Shinzo Abe did want to spend more time with the United States. Because President Trump, in a way, is like a broken record when at one point he says, yes, I understand. And the next moment he comes back to where he was 10 minutes ago. So it's very much important to continue to have good conversations with Donald Trump. And after all, there is no luxury for Japan to choose one from another when it comes to dealing with the POTUS. The establishment of good rapport with whoever just happens to be in the highest office in the United States makes very much important sense for Japan. And that's the reason why Shinzo Abe worked extra hard to work with Donald Trump. But I can assure you, had it been not Donald Trump administration, but the Hillary Clinton administration, I think Shinzo Abe would have had as good a rapport with Mrs. Clinton as well.
Understood. But I think the way that Shinzo Abe dealt with Donald Trump in the first term is almost cited as an example by other countries as they were preparing to deal with him in the second term. Always arrive with a new investment announcement, and in this way try to convince Donald Trump to avoid targeting Japan with additional tariffs. And it sort of worked in the first term. It isn't working now. Now, there are many countries being targeted with tariffs, so it's not necessarily the failing of the Japanese government this time. But still, do you think that there's something lacking in the Japanese government strategy without Shinzo Abe that was there last time? What's missing?
What's missing is to make Donald J. Trump himself say, wow. You know, that's big surprise is what's lacking. And one should not forget that bureaucratic channels do not necessarily work. And I think the Japanese government seems to be pulling strings as much as possible from the bureaucratic institutions of the United States. But you need to convince the topmost guy, who is Donald J. Trump, and make him say, you did a great job. You're awesome. I'm very much surprised. You know, that's the sort of messages that, well, for that matter, not only Japan, but many other countries have so far been unable to do.
I do want to stay on this kind of like legacy of the 1980s for Trump, because it you know, there are lots of quotes from memoirs of stuff of him, of people being like, why do you believe this stuff? Why are you so focused on it? And he's like, I don't know. It's what I've thought for 30 years. I think it was Gary Cohn who was like, well, President Trump, you know, when I was 18, I thought I could be a professional baseball player, but like sometimes things I think aren't true. And it's remarkable that today, you know, a singular individual in America whose political consciousness was awakened by the trade tensions between the US and Japan in the 1980s, that is now kind of, you know, reshaping the global economic order. So I just think it's worth kind of reflecting on that we're in this weird historical moment where, you know, something that should be ancient history by now, I mean, this is like 40 years ago, is still the thing that is driving kind of the most dramatic policy changes in Washington today.
Well, I wouldn't disagree with you. What's important is for Donald Trump to remember the new Japan by remember someone that he likes. Before remembering what it was like in the 1980s, if you look at Clint Eastwood's Dirty Harry movies, seldom you see Japanese cars running. in streets of state of California. However, since that time, there has been an inflow of a massive number of Japanese cars for sure. And that's the sort of image. The rising sun, the movie Rising Sun, and Japan was portrayed as a villain, as a very much horrible, terrifying sort of being. And that image and perception is something that the Japanese manufacturers and industries have had to struggle with for many years. And state by state, and no wonder Japanese companies have been the biggest or the second biggest investor in the United States. But the truth of the matter is, however you cite those facts, it wouldn't fly. It wouldn't make much impression on Donald J. Trump. Still, Donald J. Trump could remember someone with, let's say, good memories. Try to think what sort of impression he may have when he remembers Italy. He would probably remember that charming lady prime minister. And that's very much important. When Donald J. Trump remembers Japan, he just remembers how terrible the trade relationship was like in the 1980s, rather than remembering someone he cherishes, someone with whom relationship he very much values. So it takes a lot of effort on the part of the leader of the nation to forge a good relationship. This is a very much a personified relationship rather than sovereign to sovereign relationship. And I think that's what's important always to remember. In that sense, Shinzo Abe has succeeded in bringing Donald Trump's perceptions over Japan to the reality of the 21st century, but it took a huge amount of time and effort on the part of Shinzo Abe, which, as I said, was the reason why Abe played golf a number of times together with Trump. Once asked, Abe answered, "Yes, I'm certainly interested in playing golf together with someone who is an avid player, but playing golf gives you an ample amount of time alone by ourselves to speak with each other on whatever topics you could possibly speak about."
Do you think he actually liked him or humored him? I mean, what was what is your sense of the internal Shinzo Abe monologue as he's spending 3 hours with this, very interesting character?
Because many of us remember the photo from dinner at Mar-a-Lago, and the look that Abe pulled wasn't necessarily one of absolute comfort and relaxation. So I think that's why we're intrigued.
I see. There are many other photographs where Abe showed very much a relaxed posture. Abe showed a big smile, actually. I was being reminded what Shinzo Abe said to us delegates when Shinzo Abe just came back from Trump Tower, where Shinzo Abe and Donald Trump met for the first time when Donald Trump was not even president. He was just president-elect. And the first thing that Shinzo Abe told us over dinner was the following: "I got surprised. Trump in private was very much different from Trump in public. He was calm, and he was very much a good listener, and he paid keen attention to what I had to say." So it was the beginning of a very good friendship, may I say, genuine, very good friendship. And Shinzo Abe was extremely grateful when Donald Trump in Japan granted a longer than planned time meeting with victims of abduction. Some of those parents whose children were kidnapped by the state of North Korea. And unlike Donald Trump, who spent a minimum amount of time standing, Donald Trump sat together with those victims. And the other thing that Shinzo Abe got impressed is that Donald Trump remembered each and every member of the employees of his Mar-a-Lago resort. Donald Trump possibly remembered hundreds of names, first names, of course. So it's interesting to observe that Donald Trump seems to be unable to remember still the name of the Japanese prime minister.
So the golf worked quite well. I'm not that surprised to hear that Donald Trump was a good listener when he had just been surprised himself to have won and was almost in need of fellow leaders who could explain a few things to him. I mean, I think he was basically looking for friends and people to talk to on the global stage, and I'm not necessarily sure that his attitude is the same now, but that's not to say that Abe's personal qualities didn't play a role there. But I suppose I do have a question about how you and his team prepared for every meeting. You mentioned the wow factor. It was always important to turn up with something that would make President Trump say, wow. Without wanting to talk about what's going on now and the fact that this prime minister in Japan perhaps lacks a bit of a wow factor, I'm just curious about how you'd prepare a new impressive surprise for him. After all, there has been an investment deal this time round. The Nippon Steel investment has been cleared, but my impression is you're saying that that isn't enough, and last time you were able to prepare better surprises. So if you could perhaps describe to us the process that will go into preparing the next surprise before every meeting.
Yeah. And I guess sort of maybe to complement that, like, this it's a very different mode for governments to prepare, right? It's almost like you want someone who like works with celebrities or like, is good at like movie promotion or something. It's almost like a different modality of thinking about foreign relations, no?
What has not changed is this continued importance to spend more time by themselves, one-on-one, between the POTUS and the leader of the nation that he's meeting. You must spend a huge amount of time covering all sorts of issues. So prepared talking points, prepared by bureaucracy, do not actually mean much, because by spending 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours together, there's nothing that bureaucracy could cover in its entirety. So, for instance, conversation between the two leaders, Abe, Trump, went to cover some of the history issues in the modern era, in the Indo-Pacific, in Asia, more precisely. And to the surprise of many, Donald Trump once raised a question that, is it true that Japan had a war with China in the 19th century? And Shinzo Abe said, yes, Mr. President, there was a war between the Qing dynasty, China, and Japan. And Donald Trump said, wow, you must have been defeated badly. And that's not true, Mr. President. It was Japan that won the war. Really, was Mr. Trump's response. Further than that, Mr. President, there was a war between Tsarist Russia and Japan. Are you kidding? You must have been badly beaten. That's not the case. Japan actually won. You are a warrior. That's a sort of conversation. And Donald Trump really liked having those conversations, and Shinzo Abe did so. However, Donald Trump is also very much a volatile individual. He went on to say, Shinzo, you always think that Japan is in a very much precarious environment, neighborhood, Taiwan. could fall in the hands of China anytime soon. You know, those are the things that you say. But when the war erupts, it is not you Japanese, it's always us American boys and girls who shed blood, sweat, and tears. You look at us fighting with the Chinese on TV screens, Sony TV screens, don't you? To which Shinzo Abe had to answer with great care, but he was able to answer by saying, Mr. President, in order for that not to happen, I did my homework by revising the interpretation of the Constitution so that when it comes to military confrontations in the neighborhood of Japan, now the Japanese armed forces and the U.S. military can work and must work in a collective unit. And in peacetime, it is the Japanese armed forces, self-defense forces, that give protection, Mr. President, 24/7, 365 days to the military assets, ships, aircraft, personnel of the United States. And Mr. Trump did not know that, and he was awed. Is that right? Japan has changed. So it's a constant reminding that's necessary, and in order for this to be made possible, one has to have a deep conversation, long conversation.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So you've just mentioned the wow factor towards the end, at least what Abbe could say that he'd done himself. I've done my homework, I've reinterpreted Article 9. But what I hadn't realized is that there was a second layer of wows that came from history and things that Japan had achieved long before that President Trump was happy to hear about. So that's very interesting indeed.
Let's not forget Singapore, Pearl Harbor. I don't know. We got a lot of these we can.
I think Donald Trump knows about Pearl Harbor.
Okay.
May I have to say, can I say that Shinzo Abe actually liked Donald Trump? Very straightforward and broad-minded. If you build a good relationship with Donald Trump. So when Shinzo Abe stepped down as prime minister due to his illness, this was September 2020, there was a last phone call between these two individuals, Trump and Abe. It was so emotional that the interpreter in between went into crying himself. Trump said to Abe, Shinzo, I will miss you. You know, that's a sort of a tone that Donald Trump used.
This is always a difficult topic, but I'm curious whether you knew anything about President Trump's reaction when Prime Minister Abe unfortunately died, when he was killed. How did President Trump react to that? By this time, President Trump wasn't in office. This was when Biden was president.
He has continued to cherish the friendship he had with Abe, the evidence of which was shown clearly when Melania and Donald Trump extended an invitation to the wife of Shinzo Abe. Akie is her name. Akie Abe went to dine with Mr. and Mrs. Trump. The photograph that was delivered afterwards showed the kind of relaxation that you couldn't possibly imagine from Donald Trump in normal times. So I think Donald Trump was utterly shocked by the death of his friend. And each and every time he still remembers Shinzo Abe, that memory comes back to him with very much a warm feeling.
You know, I was making kind of jokes about whether or not Shinzo Abe enjoyed interacting with Trump, but I think the way, you know, I'm convinced, and maybe this is like a transition to talk about the Shinzo Abe-Xi relationship, where I imagine the sort of interactions were a lot less playful, perhaps, is the word. Yeah, what was what was his perspective coming into office about the relationship with China, and how did it evolve over time?
Well, on the first day when Abe met Trump, Abe had to say to the president-elect, North Korea may be a threat, but it's a manageable short-term threat. If you run good relationships with major powers around North Korea, like Russia, China, North Korea is a function that is very much dependent, not independent function. China is a long-term threat. First and foremost, one must remember that. That's one key message that Shinzo Abe tried very much hard to convey to the new president-elect. Shinzo Abe took office first in 2006, and that term ended only in a year. But 2006 was a momentous period. If you look back, it was in 2010, 15 years ago, the Chinese GDP overtook Japan's. Japan became the second biggest economy in the world back in 1968. So 42 years after that, Japan was overtaken by China. It was writing on the wall. And with that, the Chinese military built-up was awesome. And now China is probably 5 times as large as Japan. And if you look at the military balance in the Western Pacific or the Indo-Pacific, it is China that's maintaining the biggest naval presence. And as Elbridge Colby mentioned several times, the United States could ill afford to provide Australia with nuclear-powered strategic submarines because the United States is in short of military assets such as that in counterbalancing China. And that's the sort of scenario that Shinzo Abe had. And I think he knew very well that Japan could not cope with China alone by itself anyway. So you need to build a wider network of allies and partners. First and foremost, you need to recalibrate the U.S.-Japan alliance. You needed to reinvest into that. But in addition to that, you must bring Japan closer to allies or partners. And the prime candidates, for that matter, were Australia and India. So Japan, under Shinzo Abe, made a lot of effort in bringing Indo-Japanese and Australia-Japanese relationship to a level where you could call these partnerships alliance relationships. And after building some sort of diplomatic capital and after implementing some of the legislative bills, which eventually have made it possible for Japan to work with the United States as a collective seamless unit, then Xi Jinping's attitude mellowed, if you like. And it gives us a very good lesson that if you wish to have a manageable relationship with China, you need to show no weakness. You need to show strength. And I think Shinzo Abe did that by cementing Japan's relationship with the United States, even under Donald Trump, and by forging, for instance, the Pacific-wide trade regime, CP, Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, even without the United States. And Quad was another set up, Indo-Australia, Japanese, American military network. And even Japan under Shinzo Abe made it possible for Japan and some of the select NATO member nations who share maritime orientations to work more closely together. By the way, in a month, the UK's new aircraft carrier, one of the new aircraft carriers, Prince of Wales, and its strike group will make a port call to Tokyo and Yokosuka, and it's a symbolic act. And the two nations, the UK and Japan, are talking now about making it regular for those strike groups to come to Japan. By the way, you said Donald Trump remembers Pearl Harbor. For sure he does remember. But I'm curious if he remembers that shortly after Pearl Harbor, Japan's military sank the newest battleship of the Royal Navy. The name was Prince of Wales. So we have come a long way. Prince of Wales now, HMS, His Majesty's ship, Prince of Wales and its strike group and Japanese Navy boats will exhibit a massive joint trip, possibly joined by the Filipino Navy and Australian Navy. I'm not sure, but if that happens, that would be even greater.
That allows me, Tomohiko, to ask quite a nerdy question about the early Abe era, his first term. So this is before China overtook Japanese GDP, although you said the writing was on the wall. It's before Xi Jinping. It's before China restricted the export of some critical minerals to Japan a few years later in 2010, 2011. So a lot of this aggressive behavior by China had not been exhibited yet. And nonetheless, Abe had already made a speech to India's parliament in 2007, which I'm sure you influenced a little bit at the time, which I think suggested there was already some concern that the Pacific would be less navigable, less free, and that's when he developed the whole free and open Indo-Pacific concept. So why do you think so early, so long before Donald Trump became president, why do you think he already had this concern about China?
It was in the year 2008 when the Chinese authorities started to send their official ships to provoke Japanese territorial waters, particularly around the chain of islands, Senkaku. So when Shinzo Abe was in office 2006 and 7, the Chinese started to use its physical presence felt acutely by surrounding nations. In the South China Sea, the Chinese started to develop their military presence, and whether or not there should be a code of conduct signed between China and the ASEAN nations had until that time been hotly discussed. So Chinese ambition was quite clear. And if you look at the map, it's obvious that without having presence either in the South China Sea or over Japanese Okinawa island chain, the Chinese could not possibly gain access to blue water. And it was also obvious that in order to fuel the growth of Chinese economy, copper, rare minerals from countries such as Chile, Peru, were very much important. And in order to secure the free passage of the sea lane between South America and China, they started to look at some of those countries in the middle of the South Pacific, such as Fiji. And investment into Fiji had already begun, and it was not doubtful about Chinese ambition. I, for one, had a chance of a rare opportunity of speaking with the late Andrew Marshall, the Yoda of Pentagon, who gave consultations to a number of presidents back from Richard Nixon, who told us that in order for Japan, and for that matter the United States, to cope with this rising behemoth of China, it needs to, it is vitally important for us to look at the maritime domain, because Chinese coastline is relatively short. Japan has got the eighth largest exclusive economic zone, and Australia is a big island nation, so you must work together to sort of give pressure from the seas to China. So when Shinzo Abe spoke about confluence of the two seas, namely Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, he was well versed as regards the geostrategic picture that was rapidly in the making.
So, as last year's Marshall Foundation Andrew Marshall scholar, I'm always happy to hear that his influence has spread across time and space. By the way, my glasses are also an Andrew Marshall homage. We're trying to bring his fashion back for everyone on YouTube.
Yeah. I'd never heard the Yoda of the Pentagon. That was good.
What has always been remarkable to me is the it's not just like elite politicians who have this view towards China. Even before 2010, 2011, the Senkaku disputes, rare earths, what have you, you still had Japan as one of the lowest countries in the world for like polling of like favorability towards China. But I think around then it was like 20%. And now we're down to below 10%, which I think is the most, or the second, like the second or the least second highest country in the world. Even the U.S. is still up at like 35% as a polling favorability towards China. So it was already still pretty dark. Back in the pre-Xi era, which I think is a remarkable thing. Can you help me sort of interpret those numbers of why even in the 2000s, before you had all of this sort of naval aggression, the populace at large was so skeptical of the PRC?
Two things: long history and modern history. Modern in the sense that in the 1970s and 80s, like the United States, Japan made rapprochement with PRC in 1972. And since that time, China did well in projecting a friendly image towards countries like Japan. Panda diplomacy worked well. And in the 1970s and in the early 1980s, China was happy projecting a perception to the Japanese that it was a faithful student of making their economy modern and advanced. And one has to say, had it not been for Nippon Steel, which was then called Shin Nippon Steel, the Chinese steelmaking industry would not have taken off that much rapidly. And also, as regards a lot of manufacturing know-hows and industrial knowledge, Japan, the closest neighbor to China, played an important role. And many of the generations worked to that end from Japan had this tremendous sense of guilt about what Japan did during the war. And so that was the happy honeymoon period that lasted about 10, 15 years. Poll after poll taken that time indicated that Japan had a very high trust level, even higher than the one Japan had vis-a-vis the United States at the time. Long gone are those periods. And then some long memories kick in, and by which I mean that dates back to even millennia. If you ask what makes Japan Japan? I would answer by saying that Japan is Japan because Japan is not China. What does it mean? Japan actually did borrow some important cultural traits such as written characters, but in the Sino-centric suzerain tributary world order, Japan was a proud outlier. It was only between the 15th and 16th centuries. I must check my history book, but for about 70 years, Japan was happy being a dependent nation on China. The Chinese emperor did give recognition to the head of the warrior regime of Japan, but with that being rather an exception. Japan was not in the orbit of Chinese-centric civilization. And that's actually given a proud to Japan. And in the modern era, since the 19th century, one of the sources of pride for Japan was that Japan was the only nation that evaded the fate of colonization from the Western powers. However, during the same time, China developed an understandably a big amount of grudge and bad feelings toward Japan. After all, Japan was the only Asian nation that did tremendous harm on top of the humiliations that the Chinese had already suffered from Britain, France, and Russia, and so on. So that's the sort of subtly and densely knitted emotional connections between the two. These days, a daily phenomenon is that there is an influx of Chinese tourists, students, investors in Japan, and that's been causing a daily sort of wake-up call to the Japanese. 1 out of 4 registered foreigners are the Chinese, mainland Chinese. 50% of foreign students working in name brand universities are Chinese. Tokyo real estate property market has gone up remarkably, primarily because of the massive amount of investment flowing into Tokyo from Shanghai and other areas of China. I call this phenomenon remembering what it was called between Australia, Japan, a tyranny of proximity, not tyranny of distance. Tyranny of distance is something that Australians always used when describing the distance between their motherland, namely Britain, and Australia. But China and Japan are very much close together geographically, and I think there's a sort of tyranny of proximity. And the current election, the upper house election, has turned to make this issue more prominent. And for some foreigners living in Japan, it may sound a little bit scary because all of a sudden the Japanese sound xenophobic. But it's mainly not about Americans, not about Vietnamese, not about the Filipinos, but about the Chinese. And I think this phenomenon is going to continue to be a daily concern. So in order for Japan to cope with this new phenomenon, first and foremost, you need to have political stability, you need to have clear-cut leadership, you need to have determined leadership who could say both to China and to the Japanese. To China, she must be able to say that don't underestimate the will of the Japanese, don't ever underestimate the resolve of the Japanese, but also to the Japanese people, don't panic, calm down, try to accommodate the Chinese in a balanced way. So those dual messages are the ones that you need to hear from the Japanese leadership, but you can just detect the tone with which I'm speaking of this issue, because I'm pessimistic. I'm not optimistic whether this sort of leadership would emerge anytime soon in Japan.
Thank you. We want to discuss the election in a very short moment, but given we were discussing the awareness of China's rise, public opinion in Japan having a very negative view of China, and yet at the same time, there was quite a lot of criticism of Prime Minister Abe when he tried to reinterpret Article 9, which in its interpretation before his premiership made it very difficult for Japan to do anything other than self-defense. You mentioned that Donald Trump was impressed that Japan had done its homework, but not everyone in Japan was impressed by those changes, and yet, in public opinion, it does seem there does seem to be quite a unanimous view that is skeptical of China. So why did those two things happen at the same time? Negative views of China, but also a negative view of Japan having a greater ability to defend itself and its allies.
I remember the days when Japanese Prime Minister's official residence was surrounded by thousands of protesters. Interestingly, however, there was a unique profile about those protesters. That is that many of them were Japanese baby boomers in their 70s even. And they fought, if you like, one final fight against the incumbent power.
Against the man.
Against the man. And the change that Abe introduced was so unprecedented and new that naturally I understand there was a considerable amount of hesitance and reluctance on the part of the public to change the modus operandi, the common picture. But on the other hand, there was a growing concern held widely about this growth of Chinese military. So in that sense, even many of those protesters were sort of bifurcated. And now when 10 years, literally 10 years passed since the enaction of the bill that made it possible for the Japanese armed forces to work with the United States in a seamless manner, I think people in Japan have generally accepted the change introduced into that. However, the real revision of the Constitution, which Shinzo Abe earnestly wanted to achieve, did not materialize. He wanted to add one small sentence to the renowned Article 9 by legitimizing the presence of the armed forces of Japan. If I may remind, the Article 9 has two parts. One, renunciation of warfare. That's good enough because the peoples in the world have made warfare illegal since the First World War. So that's not an issue. The second part of the article is still unique. It says, to that end, Japan possesses no means of warfare. That's clearly a signature of Douglas MacArthur and the liberal-minded members of the occupation force. But almost the next day, Korean War erupted, and Japan and the United States, for that matter, have had to make this white lie continuously. You get an awesome presence of Japanese self-defense forces. Japan is going to equip itself with as many as 400 F-35 most advanced fighter aircraft, Aegis destroyers. Japan has quite a few. And Japan finally is going to have a small but effective aircraft carrier being able to accommodate F-35 fighter aircraft. So, are they not means of warfare? Certainly they are. So the Japanese and, for that matter, Americans have had to make this white lie. But it's caused a negative impact on the members of the self-defense forces because they have been regarded as something illegal, even unconstitutional. So Shinzo Abe wanted to add one clause only to legitimize the presence of the Japanese armed forces to no avail. That's something that Shinzo Abe was not able to achieve.
So it would be remiss of us not to talk about the present and the immediate future in the next few days. There's an election in Japan on Sunday. I believe only half of the upper house is up for re-election. So it's a bit like the US Senate when not all the senators are running at the same time. But perhaps you could share your expectations. I hear there's a debate, or I hear there isn't a consensus over whether the current coalition government will keep its majority. So what is your prediction?
The coalition government, the ruling coalition, is already a minority coalition in the lower house. And in the Japanese parliamentary system, the upper house is much, much stronger than is the case with countries like India or the United Kingdom. And it is almost certain, given the circumstances, the LDP, Liberal Democratic Party, and its coalition partner will lose their simple majority even in the upper house. If that happens, nothing would be determined in a swift fashion. Everything is going to be determined in a quid pro quo way, and much, much less transparency because more things have to be done behind the scenes between the party operatives from the ruling and the opposition. So I'm very much concerned about the loss of direction going forward. Already, over the last 3 years since Abe passed away, I think there's a sense of directionlessness sets in. Many young generations once favored Abe administration, left the ruling coalition, and jumping into newly formed parties which are unknown sort of presence. One thing that I must say is that there is someone who would potentially benefit from this chaotic situation that is going to take place after the elections, and that someone is Russia. And Russia is making a huge confusion into the SNS sphere by using bot applications. Those SNS entries that discredit the ruling coalition got amplified, and those favoring opposition parties equally got amplified because of this engineered bot situation. So,
is this receiving much coverage? Is this being covered much in the press? Because, I mean, listeners will remember how much this came up in the 2016 campaign in the US, also in the Brexit referendum. So I'm not surprised that Russia has been pointed out as the culprit, but how are the Japanese voters responding to this news?
Well, frankly speaking, it's been in the news only over the last couple of days, and the question whether or not the general public are duly concerned about this, I would say not so much at the moment. But finally, as you say, Japan has caught up with the United States and Britain, for that matter. I'm very much curious about the seeming lack of Chinese influence, for that matter, because China would equally benefit from the confusion that Japan's politics is going to have.
They're just relying on their partners to do it for them, perhaps.
Maybe.
That's speculation. I did want to ask about some of the factors that are driving the election. Both Jordan and I are in the US, and we have the tendency, as many will, to see everything through the lens of what's going on here. So I'm sure the tariffs have played a role, but I was amazed to see just how high inflation has been in Japan. The price of rice has really skyrocketed over the past few years. So independent of how the US is behaving towards Japan, there are many other things going on that will influence voters' behavior. So what's driving this election?
Tariffs have been important as a factor because it showed to the voters that the current incumbent administration, Prime Minister Ishiba's administration, has failed to secure early deals with the United States.
They're not alone. Only two countries have.
Yes, in my view, that's exactly the reason why the Japanese public have not made these tariff issues as prominent, as important. Inflation is an issue. Why so? It's indicative. It's a quintessential Japanese phenomenon for that matter. This country has more elderly citizens than many other nations, and many of them are dependent on fixed income, namely pension. So pensions will not rise, prices will. And that's made a lot of people nervous. And the younger generations, for that matter, grossly discontented because they know that the government cares much, much more about the senior citizens. They are the ones that will continue to live well into the next century, the 22nd century. The 18-year-olds today who are eligible to vote will live another 80 years perhaps. So they are naturally frustrated by the fact that the current politicians, ruling opposition, both talk much, much more about how to compensate the, decrease of revenues for the elderly. Inflation is painful, especially in a country that's got less number of young people and more senior citizens.
I'm just curious what you think will happen to Prime Minister Ishiba after Sunday.
There are two interpretations. No one knows for sure which one is going to take place. He seems to be interested in sticking to where he is, and after all, the government that's going to emerge after the elections will be a coalition government of sort. And after all, since the ruling coalition lost the majority in the lower house, it's been Prime Minister Ishiba who has somehow maintained a subtle balance between the Liberal Democratic Party and the opposition parties. And when it comes to the prime ministerial contenders within the LDP, not many would be interested in taking charge in such difficult circumstances. So let Ishiba continue to bite bitter pills, bitter medicines, may be a prevalent feeling among the ruling party members. And if that's the case, if that will be the case, I would imagine political apathy would be deepened, and people would get frustrated even further, and eventually the new government may have to be pushed into dissolving the lower house. And chances are, even if the prime minister dissolves the lower house, the snap elections will result in even worse consequences for the LDP. Either way, you should anticipate that for the next couple of years, Japanese politics will be far from stable. And again, that's going to be a fertile ground for the Chinese to make all kinds of provocations and even assaults. And I think that's what's happening already.
Cheeky question. What did Shinzo Abe think of Mr. Ishiba?
Mr. Ishiba was known to be a designated outlier in the LDP establishment. Mr. Ishiba was a straight talker when it comes to making critiques about the incumbent, namely Shinzo Abe. So I wouldn't say that Abe and Ishiba were on good terms, even though Abe included Ishiba twice as a member of his own cabinet.
So you've spent a long time working in media. I'm curious, there's a lot of kind of discourse in the US about the health or death of journalists and media outlets. Like, what's your take on the well-being of Japanese political coverage and international analysis in the press?
Legacy media, print media, broadcasting media have lost their trust very much rapidly. And people spend much more time on what the SNS sphere says. Like in many other nations, many in Japan, in their sort of
Bubble?
bubble, and reciting messages of similar kind all the time. When it comes to international coverage, the lack of revenues for the legacy media have actually worked to their detriment. Many companies can no longer afford dispatching correspondence across the world, and so they have had to rely upon the purchased video clips, possibly from BBC and so on. So Japan's been introducing the same sort of bias you may or may not detect in those international media coverage. What's important for this is that there's been a massive growth of anti-Israeli feeling, because each and every time if you turn on the TV or you look at YouTube entries, you get the messages created by Al Jazeera, no one else. So every time you see kids injured and carried to hospital beds, and it's a powerful message that's shaped the views of ordinary Japanese about the Gaza situation. 3 years ago, if you ask what your view about Israel is, 70% of the Japanese would say, I have no idea. The rest of the Japanese would have said, Israel is an advanced technology-oriented country. But now, a lot of people have turned anti-Israeli. And that's primarily to do with the fact that almost all coverage is coming from Al Jazeera.
That's fascinating.
I have noticed the output of NHK World has become a little bit more entertaining. They now have sumo wrestling matches with very good English language commentary. So I advise listeners to go and have a look. I remember stumbling on NHK World about 7-8 years ago and finding it quite boring. It is better now.
Only because they're airing the sumo matches these days.
That's one considerable factor, but it's not the only one.
Say we get a new prime minister in the next few weeks. Is there one book, either Japanese or English, that you want to assign whoever that person is going to be?
Well, by 70%, it's a fair chance that Shigeru Ishiba, will continue to stick to where he is, despite massive frustrations and oppositions. One thing that makes me frustrated all the time is that, unlike in the United States or in the United Kingdom, for that matter, biographies, long sketches of some important individual have not been in the tradition of political coverage of this country. So biographies are being written only after spending a huge amount of time after the death of the person, of the subject.
Whereas in the US, there's a nice tradition of autobiographies. I was wondering if Vice President Vance's autobiography has made its way to Japan, and maybe you could even give us the translation of Hillbilly Elegy. What's the Japanese for Hillbilly Elegy?
Right, Hillbilly Elegy has been translated into Japan very much early, and many people have started to buy that book again when Vice President Vance was chosen as Trump's running mate.
What's the title in Japanese?
The same. In phonetic language, katakana, Hillbilly Elegy.
Oh, I
That's the
see.
same.
That's disappointing.
Yeah, we're very disappointed. Could we try and translate it? What would the words be in Japanese?
Well, I'm not sure how many of your listeners do understand, but literally translated into Japanese, inaka mono no hiai, that's an elegy of someone from extremely rural background.
Perfect. That's exactly what we needed.
All right. Well, this was a pleasure. Thank you so much for being a part of ChinaTalk.